How scarcity changes decision making. Two people walk into the same job interview, same company, same role, same hiring manager asking the same questions. One of them has been out of work for 5 months. Her savings are almost gone. She has sent out over 100 applications. This is one of 3 callbacks she has gotten in the last 2 months. Her rent is due in 12 days. The other person already has a job. It pays fine. She is not desperate to leave. A recruiter reached out and the role sounded interesting, so she said yes to the interview. If it does not work out, nothing changes. She goes back to her desk on Monday. Same room, same conversation, same opportunity. But these 2 people are not having the same experience. They are not making decisions the same way. They are not hearing the same words the same way. And they will not respond to what comes next the same way. The first woman hears the hiring manager say, "We're still interviewing other candidates." And her stomach drops. She starts thinking about what she can say to stand out. She starts wondering if she came across as too eager or not eager enough. She replays her answers in her head. She thinks about what she will write in the follow-up email. She wonders if she should mention the other companies she has talked to, even though none of them have called her back. She thinks about what she will do if this does not work out. She thinks about her rent. The second woman hears the same sentence. She nods. She says, "That makes sense. Take your time." She means it. She is not performing calm. She is calm, because nothing rides on this. She already has a paycheck coming on Friday. Now the offer comes in. It is lower than expected. The benefits are thin. The start date is tight. The role is slightly different from what was described. The first woman looks at the offer and thinks, "Can I make this work?" She starts calculating. She starts adjusting her expectations downward. She starts talking herself into it. She thinks about the gap on her resume getting longer. She thinks about her credit card balance. She thinks, "It's not perfect, but it's something. I can always look for something better once I'm stable." She accepts. The second woman looks at the same offer and thinks, "That's not what I'm looking for." She emails back with a counter. She asks about the title, the salary band, the review cycle. If they meet her halfway, great. If not, she declines and moves on. She does not need to talk herself into anything because she does not need this to work. Same offer, same number on the page. But one person sees a lifeline, the other sees a lowball. That difference has nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with confidence, nothing to do with personality, nothing to do with self-esteem or ambition or how much either person respects themselves. It has everything to do with scarcity. What scarcity does to your mind. Scarcity is what happens when you do not have enough of something you need. Money, time, options, support, safety, information, energy. Most people think scarcity just limits what you can do. You have less money, so you buy less. You have less time, so you skip things. That part is obvious. That part everyone already understands. But scarcity does something else. Something less obvious and far more important. It changes how you think. When something you need is running low, your mind locks onto it. It becomes the thing you think about first, last, and in between. It crowds out everything else. Not because you are weak, not because you are bad at planning, not because you are anxious by nature, but because your brain is doing exactly what it is built to do. It is treating the scarce thing as urgent. It is putting it at the front of the line. And when your brain treats something as urgent, It stops treating other things as important. Things that matter a great deal in the long run get pushed to the side. Not permanently, not deliberately, but effectively. Because there is only so much room in your head at any given moment, and the scarce thing is taking up most of it. This is not a character flaw. It is a predictable response to a real situation, and it happens to everyone. The person who is calm and strategic when things are stable becomes narrow and reactive when something they depend on starts to disappear. The person who makes thoughtful decisions when they have room becomes impulsive when the walls close in. The problem is not that people become stupid under scarcity. The problem is that scarcity reorganizes what you pay attention to. It makes the short term feel like the only term. It makes the thing you lack feel like the only thing that matters. Everything else fades into background noise. That is when decisions start to change. Not because the person changed, but because the lens they are looking through changed. How scarcity builds itself into everyday situations. Scarcity does not always arrive as a crisis. Sometimes it builds slowly, and it often starts with something small enough that you do not notice it reshaping how you think. Think about a freelancer who loses one client. She had 4, now she has 3. The work is still manageable. The income dips a little, but she can cover her bills. There is no emergency. Nothing dramatic happened. But something shifts. She starts checking her email more often. She starts saying yes to projects she would have turned down a month ago. She stops being selective about who she works with. She takes a job that pays less than her usual rate because she is thinking about the gap, not the rate. She starts working weekends, not because the work requires it, but because idle time now feels like falling behind. Nobody told her to lower her standards. Nobody pressured her. The math just changed in her head. One fewer client did not just reduce her income. It reduced her sense of security. And that changed what felt reasonable to accept. Now think about a manager who has one open position and 2 strong candidates. He likes both, but he can only pick one. That is a normal constraint. He evaluates them carefully. He thinks about team dynamics. He sleeps on it. He makes a choice and moves on. But think about a different manager who has one open position, one decent candidate, and a team that is drowning. His people are burning out. Projects are slipping. 2 people have mentioned they are thinking of leaving. He needs someone in that seat now, not next month. Not after another round of interviews. Now, that manager is not evaluating the candidate the same way. He is not asking, is this person the right fit for the next 3 years? He is asking, can this person start Monday? The question itself has changed because of what he lacks. And the answer he is willing to accept has changed with it. He knows the hire might not be ideal, but the cost of waiting feels worse than the cost of settling. This is how scarcity reshapes decisions before anyone realizes it. It does not force you to choose badly. It changes what you are choosing between. It replaces the question you should be asking with the question the pressure makes you ask. Here is another example. A couple is looking for an apartment. They have 2 months before their lease ends. They see 6 places over 3 weekends. 3 are fine, 2 are bad, 1 is great but expensive. They take their time, they compare, they negotiate. They walk away from the first offer that does not feel right. They are in no rush, so every option gets weighed against every other option. Now imagine they have 5 days. Their landlord sold the building. The new owner wants them out. They need a place by Friday. They see 2 apartments after work on Tuesday. One is too small, one is overpriced. They take the overpriced one. They do not negotiate. They do not ask about the lease terms. They sign that evening. They are grateful it is available. Same couple, same taste, same budget. But the decisions look completely different because the time changed. And if you were watching from the outside, you might think, why did they pay that much? Why didn't they push back on the lease terms? Why didn't they keep looking? But if you were standing in their shoes with 5 days and nowhere to go, you would do the same thing. Because when you are running out of time, you stop optimizing and start surviving. You stop asking what is best and start asking what is available. Scarcity does not have to be dramatic to work like this. It can be subtle, quiet, almost invisible. A person with one close friend depends on that friendship differently than someone with 10. An employee with no other job prospects relates to their boss differently than someone with 3 standing offers. A business with 1 major client makes different choices than a business with 20 clients. A student applying to 1 graduate program feels different about the application than a student who applied to 8. In every case, the scarcity is not just reducing options. It is changing the weight of each remaining option. The fewer things you have, the more each one matters. And the more something matters, the harder it is to risk losing it. The harder it is to push back. The harder it is to say no. The harder it is to wait for something better. That is where the real shift happens. Not in the moment of the big decision, but in the slow accumulation of small adjustments that happen long before the decision arrives. How scarcity shows up in what people say and how they say it. When scarcity is present, you can hear it. Not because people announce it. Most people never say, I am operating from a position of need right now. But it leaks through. It changes the texture of how they talk, how they write, how they wait, and how they fill silence. Think about the way someone asks for a raise when they have another offer versus when they do not. The person with another offer says, I've been looking at the market, and I think my compensation should reflect my contributions more accurately. I'd like to discuss an adjustment. The tone is steady. The pacing is relaxed. There is no rush. There is an implied alternative sitting behind every word. They do not need to explain why this matters. The fact that they are bringing it up is enough. The person without another offer says almost the same words, but the delivery is different. The sentences come a little faster. There is more explaining, more justifying, more filling the space. I've really enjoyed working here, and I think I've been contributing a lot to the team, and I was hoping we could talk about whether there's any room to adjust where things stand, because I want to make sure I'm being valued, and I'm committed to staying. There are extra words everywhere. And those extra words are not confidence. They are padding. They are protection against the moment the other person says no. Because if the other person says no, they have nowhere else to go. So they cushion the ask in advance, hoping to soften a rejection they cannot afford to receive. When you have no alternative, no is a wall. When you have an alternative, no is a door to a different conversation. And the way you speak reflects which one you are facing. Scarcity also changes how people respond to silence. A person negotiating from a position of plenty can sit in silence after making a request. They can wait. They can let the quiet stretch out. They are not afraid of the pause because the pause does not cost them anything. If anything, the silence works in their favor. It puts the weight on the other person to respond. A person negotiating from scarcity fills the silence. They keep talking. They soften their ask. They start negotiating against themselves before the other person has said a single word in response. I mean, I'm flexible on the number. I understand if the timing isn't right. We don't have to decide today. I just wanted to put it out there. All of this happens in the space the other person left empty. The silence felt unbearable because the stakes were too high to just sit there and wait. This shows up in writing too. Emails, text messages, direct messages. Someone applying for a job they desperately need sends a long, careful email. They reread it 4 times. They adjust the subject line. They add a line about being flexible on start date. They thank the person twice. They sign off with something warm, but not too warm. Every word is deliberated because they cannot afford for any word to be wrong. Someone applying for a job they do not need sends a shorter email. It is friendly but direct. They do not over-explain why they are interested. They do not hedge. They do not add extra lines of gratitude. Not because they are rude or careless, but because there is no fear underneath the words. The email is lighter because the stakes are lighter. You can hear scarcity in meetings too. An employee who feels secure in their position will push back on a bad idea. They will say, "I'm not sure that's the right approach," or "I see it differently." They will disagree openly because disagreeing does not threaten their standing. Their job is not on the line. Their relationship with the boss can absorb some friction. An employee who feels expendable will stay quiet, or they will agree, or they will frame their disagreement so carefully that it barely sounds like disagreement at all. That's an interesting approach. I wonder if we might also want to think about the real thought gets buried in layers of politeness and qualification. Not because the person is naturally passive, not because they lack opinions, but because the cost of being wrong, of being seen as difficult, of standing out in the wrong way, feels too high when they are not sure their position is safe. Scarcity does not silence people. It filters them. It makes them calculate before they speak. And the calculation is not about what is true or what is helpful. It is about what is safe to say, given what they cannot afford to lose. Watch how people handle follow-ups, and you will see this pattern even more clearly. A vendor who has many clients sends 1 follow-up and waits. A vendor who needs this particular deal sends 2, then 3, then a just checking in message a few days later, then a wanted to make sure this didn't get buried email the week after that. The follow-ups are not aggressive. They are anxious. Each one is a small signal that says, "I need this more than you do." And both sides can feel it. The person on the receiving end registers that energy. Not always consciously, but they feel it. They start to sense that they have leverage. They take a little longer to respond. They become a little less careful with the details. They stop apologizing for delays. Not because they are cruel or manipulative, but because the urgency on the other side gives them room to relax. The less you need something, the more space you have to be casual about it. The more someone else needs it, the less you have to try. How people can misread what scarcity is doing. When you watch someone make decisions under scarcity, It is easy to misread what is happening, and most people do every single time. The most common misreading is this: they think the person is choosing badly because of who they are, not because of what they are facing. A friend stays in a job where she is underpaid and overworked. You think, she doesn't value herself enough? She should stand up for herself. But she has no savings, 2 kids, and no second income. She is not lacking self-worth. She is managing risk with very little room to move. Walking away is not an option she has. It is a fantasy she cannot afford to entertain this month. A coworker agrees to take on a project no one else wants. The hours are bad, the scope is unclear, and the credit will probably go to someone above him. You think, he's such a pushover. He never says no, but he is the newest person on the team. He has no track record yet. He has not built enough goodwill to decline anything. He is not weak. He is trying to build enough standing to eventually earn the right to say no. A relative buys something cheap that breaks in a month and has to buy it again. You think, that's such a waste of money. If she'd just spent more the first time, she wouldn't be replacing it. But she could not afford the better version up front. She did not have the luxury of buying quality. She bought what she could reach with what she had in that moment. And the cost of replacing it is the tax she pays for not having enough money to spend more the first time. She knows that. She just cannot get to the savings that come with having more to spend up front. This is one of the deepest misreadings people make about each other. They see the outcome and judge the person, but they are not seeing the constraints. They are not seeing the walls. When you have plenty, your good decisions look like wisdom. When you have little, your forced decisions look like poor judgment. The only difference between the two is the size of the space you had to move in. People also misread confidence. They look at someone who speaks clearly, negotiates firmly, and walks away from bad offers, and they think that person really knows their worth. They have great self-esteem. But often, the person who negotiates well is simply the person who can afford to walk away. The confidence is not coming from inside. It is coming from the options sitting behind them. Remove the options and the confidence goes with them. Not because the person changed, because the ground under their feet changed. And they look at someone who accepts less, who does not push back, who takes the first offer without questioning it. And they think that person does not know their worth. But that person may know exactly what they are worth. They just cannot afford to hold out for it right now. This misreading goes both directions. The person experiencing scarcity often misreads themselves. They start to believe their own hesitation is a character flaw. They think, I should be more assertive. I should push back more. I should stop settling. And they feel ashamed. They compare themselves to the person who negotiates effortlessly and wonder what is wrong with them. But the problem is not their personality. The problem is the math. And no amount of positive self-talk changes the math. At the same time, the person with more resources often misreads their own success. They think their calmness is discipline. They think their patience is virtue. They think their willingness to walk away from a bad deal is proof of strong character. And some of that may be true. But much of what looks like character is actually cushion. It is the breathing room that comes from not needing this particular thing to work out. This is why advice from people who have plenty often sounds hollow to people who have little. Just walk away if they don't respect you. Know your worth. Don't settle for less than you deserve. That advice assumes you have somewhere to walk to. It assumes your worth can be converted into money this month. It assumes settling is a choice you are making, rather than a calculation the situation is forcing. The advice is not wrong in the abstract. It is just disconnected from the conditions it would need to be useful. And the person giving it usually cannot see that disconnect, because they have never had to make a decision from inside those conditions. When scarcity is present, the most rational thing a person can do often looks irrational from the outside. And the most confident-seeming person in the room is often just the one with the most exits. How scarcity locks people in and what breaks the pattern. The hardest thing about scarcity is that it tends to create more of itself. When you accept a lower salary because you needed the job, you now have less money. Less money means fewer options next time. Fewer options next time means you are more likely to accept another bad deal. And so it goes. When you take on a difficult client because you needed the revenue, you now have less time and more stress. Less time means you cannot look for better clients. No better clients means you stay dependent on the difficult one. The scarcity of options created a scarcity of time, which preserved the scarcity of options. When you stay in a draining relationship because you are afraid of being alone, you spend your emotional energy managing that relationship. That leaves less energy for building new connections. Fewer connections means more dependence on the draining one. And the cycle tightens. This is the loop. Scarcity forces a short-term decision. The short-term decision reduces long-term capacity. Reduced long-term capacity creates more scarcity. And around it goes quietly, steadily, without anyone choosing it or wanting it. In workplaces, you can see this cycle in how people manage their standing. An employee who feels secure will share credit, take smart risks, and absorb the occasional failure without spiraling. They can afford to be generous because generosity does not threaten them. An employee who feels like their position is fragile will hoard credit, avoid risk, and treat every mistake as a potential threat to their survival. They play it safe on every decision. They do not volunteer ideas that might be wrong. They do not disagree with anyone who has more power. The hoarding and avoidance can make them harder to work with, which weakens their standing further, which makes them feel less secure, which makes them hoard and avoid even more. The scarcity of safety creates the very behavior that makes safety harder to earn. Nobody tells them to act that way. Nobody sits them down and says, "You should be more defensive about your reputation." The scarcity does it for them. It changes what feels risky and what feels safe. And the behavior follows the feeling. So how does the pattern break? The most straightforward answer is that the scarcity itself ends. You get a better job, you build savings, you find stable housing, you add a meaningful relationship, you develop a new skill that opens a door. When the pressure lifts, the decision-making changes almost immediately. The same person who is accepting bad deals starts turning them down. The same person who stayed quiet in meetings starts speaking up. The same person who sent anxious follow-up emails starts waiting patiently. They did not read a self-help book. They did not have a breakthrough. They did not finally decide to believe in themselves. The math changed, and the behavior followed. But scarcity does not always end on its own. Sometimes you have to build small pockets of breathing room, while still inside the pressure. This looks different depending on the situation. For a freelancer, it might mean blocking off one afternoon a week to reach out to new contacts, even when current projects feel urgent. For someone in a bad job, it might mean quietly applying to 2 positions a week, even when the workload makes it hard to find time. For someone in an unbalanced relationship, it might mean reconnecting with one old friend. Just one. Just to remember that other connections exist. None of these actions solve the scarcity right away, but they create a small crack in the cycle. They introduce one option into a space where there were none. And even one option changes the internal experience of every other decision. Because now you are not choosing between this and nothing. You are choosing between this and something else. That shift from nothing to something is where the pattern begins to loosen. There is also something important that happens when people simply recognize the dynamic for what it is. When you understand that your hesitation is not weakness, but a reasonable response to limited options, you stop blaming yourself for it. That does not fix the situation, but it stops the situation from becoming 2 problems stacked on top of each other. The first problem is the scarcity itself. The second problem is the shame you feel about how you are responding to it. And the shame, in its own quiet way, makes the scarcity worse. Because shame makes you hide. Hiding makes you less likely to ask for help, to reach out, to take the small steps that might crack things open. Recognizing the dynamic also changes how you see other people. When you watch someone accept a bad deal or stay in a bad situation or fail to push back, and you understand what scarcity does to the mind, you stop judging them for it. You start seeing the structure underneath the behavior instead of just the behavior itself. And when you stop judging, you become more likely to help. Not with advice about what they should do, not with instructions to believe in themselves more, but with the thing they actually need. One more option, one more connection, one more week of breathing room. Because that is what breaks the pattern. Not better thinking, not stronger willpower, not more self-esteem, more room to think in. How scarcity moves power between people. Whenever one person has less of something they need and another person controls access to it, power shifts. This is not a theory. It is something you can watch happen in real time, in ordinary conversations every single day. Think about a landlord and a tenant. In a balanced market, both sides have leverage. The landlord wants a reliable tenant. The tenant wants a good apartment. They negotiate from roughly equal positions. The landlord describes the apartment carefully. The tenant asks questions and takes time to decide. Both sides are working to earn the other's agreement. Now imagine the rental market tightens. Apartments are scarce. The landlord has 5 applicants for every unit. The tenant has been looking for 3 weeks with nothing. Watch how the communication changes. The landlord's listing gets shorter, less descriptive, fewer photos, less effort. They do not need to sell the apartment. The apartment sells itself through its mere availability. Responses to inquiries get slower. Showing times get less flexible. The landlord stops accommodating and starts selecting. The tenant's messages get longer, more personal, more eager. They mention how responsible they are, how quiet, how they have never missed a payment. They offer to pay several months up front. They offer to sign a longer lease. They are auditioning. Not because the landlord asked them to, but because the scarcity rearranged who needs whom. You can see this anywhere that scarcity and need are unevenly distributed. A business that has many suppliers treats each one casually. Emails are brief. Deadlines are flexible in their own favor, but rigid for the supplier. Small mistakes get called out quickly. The supplier, if they have few clients, responds promptly, follows up carefully, and absorbs frustrations without pushing back. They double-check their work. They send thank you notes. They do things no one asked them to do, hoping to make themselves harder to replace. None of this is personal. It is structural. The person who needs less from the exchange controls the pace, the tone, and the terms. The person who needs more does the adjusting. Once this pattern is established, it does not need to be enforced. Nobody has to say, "I have power here." The behavior of both sides says it already. The person with options moves slowly, speaks plainly, and does not feel the need to explain themselves. The person without options moves quickly, speaks carefully, and explains everything. Over time, this dynamic starts to feel normal. The person with less stops noticing how much they are adjusting. The person with more stops noticing that the other side is working harder. It becomes invisible to both of them. But if you know what to look for, you can see it everywhere. Notice who waits and who follows up. Notice who writes longer messages and who writes shorter ones. Notice who apologizes and who does not. Notice who explains their reasoning and who just states their decision. Notice who accommodates and who expects accommodation. These patterns are not personality traits. They are scarcity made visible through behavior. And notice what happens when the scarcity shifts. When the person who had no options suddenly gets one. A competing offer, a new client, a different apartment. Watch how quickly the communication changes. The messages get shorter. The tone gets calmer. The eagerness fades. The follow-ups stop. Not because the person finally found their backbone, but because the math underneath the conversation changed. And the math was always driving the behavior. What happens when time is the scarce thing? One of the most common forms of scarcity is not about money or options. It is about time. When you have plenty of time to make a decision, you think about it differently. You consider trade-offs. You weigh alternatives. You ask for input from people you trust. You sleep on it. You come back with fresh eyes. You notice details you missed the first time. When time is short, all of that collapses. You stop comparing and start choosing. You stop weighing and start grabbing. Not because you are careless, but because the window is closing and your brain treats the closing window as the most important fact in the room. This is why deadlines change the quality of decisions. Not because people get lazy under pressure, but because urgency narrows the field of what you can pay attention to. The deadline becomes the loudest thing in the room, and everything else gets quieter. Think about how people shop for something important when they have time versus when they do not. A person buying a car with no deadline will research for weeks. They will compare models. They will read reviews. They will test drive 4 or 5 options. They will negotiate. They will walk away from a dealer who will not meet their price. A person buying a car because their old one just died and they need to get to work on Monday will visit 1 or 2 lots, pick the best available thing, and pay close to the asking price. They know they are probably overpaying, but the cost of not having a car tomorrow is higher than the cost of overpaying today. That trade-off only exists because time is scarce, and the person making it is not foolish. They are solving for the most urgent constraint. That is what the brain does. It solves for whatever is running out. even if that means ignoring things that matter in the long run. In the workplace, time scarcity shows up as reactive decision making. A manager who has weeks to fill a position considers culture fit, growth potential, and team dynamics. A manager who needs someone yesterday considers availability. The person they hire may not be ideal, but they are the best candidate who can start now. And now is the only thing the situation allows them to optimize for. Time scarcity also changes how people communicate. When everyone is overwhelmed, messages get shorter, meetings get faster. People stop explaining their thinking and start issuing directions. Just do this. We need it by Friday. Don't worry about the other thing. This feels efficient in the moment, but it removes the context that helps people understand why decisions are being made. And when people do not understand why, they guess. And when they guess wrong, mistakes happen, which takes more time to fix, which makes the scarcity worse. This is the cycle again. Not enough time leads to cutting corners. Cutting corners leads to errors. Errors take time to fix, and now there is even less time than before. You can also see time scarcity reshape personal decisions. A parent who works long hours does not have time to cook, so they buy prepared food, which costs more. The extra cost means they need to work more hours. More hours means less time. Less time means more expensive shortcuts. The scarcity of time creates a scarcity of money, which feeds back into the scarcity of time. Or think about someone facing a health decision. A person with time to research, consult, and think will weigh their options carefully. A person who gets a diagnosis and is told they need to decide on treatment this week will grab the first option the doctor recommends. Not because they do not care about the outcome, but because the clock is louder than everything else in the room. And when the clock is that loud, careful thinking becomes a luxury you do not have access to. What scarcity makes invisible. The most important thing scarcity does is not what it forces you to choose. It is what it keeps you from seeing. When you are focused on what you lack, you cannot see the full picture. You cannot see the options that are slightly out of reach. You cannot see the long-term costs of the short-term fix. You cannot see that the deal you just accepted was not the only deal available. If only you had had another week, another connection, another small pocket of room. Scarcity shrinks the frame. It turns a wide landscape into a narrow hallway. And when you are in the hallway, you do not know there is a landscape. You just see the walls and the door at the end. And here is the part that makes it hardest to talk about. Once the decision is made, you often cannot tell that scarcity shaped it. You tell yourself the story of what happened as though you made a free choice. I took that job because it was a good opportunity. I stayed because I believed in the work. I accepted the terms because they seemed fair. The scarcity becomes invisible in the retelling. You remember the choice. You forget the pressure. This is why these dynamics are so hard to discuss honestly. The person inside them cannot always see them, and the person outside them does not feel the pressure. But if you start paying attention, you will notice something. The people who seem to make the best decisions are not always the smartest, or the bravest, or the most disciplined. They are often the ones with the most room, the most time, the most options, the most savings, the most connections. Their good judgment is real, but it grows in the space that plenty provides. And the people who seem to make the worst decisions are not always the least capable. They are often the ones with the least room, the least margin, the fewest alternatives. Their poor outcomes are real, but the outcomes were shaped by the space they did not have. The next time you watch someone accept less than they deserve, or agree too quickly, or hold on to something they should have let go of a long time ago, ask yourself, what are they running low on? What would change if they had just a little more of it? The answer is almost always the same. They would not become a different person. They would not suddenly discover courage they were missing. They would just make a different decision, because they would finally have the room to make one. Scarcity does not change who you are, but it changes what you can afford to do about it. And in everyday life, in the conversations and negotiations and choices that shape how things turn out, that difference is everything. So the next time you find yourself accepting something that does not feel right, or the next time you notice that you are over-explaining, over-thanking, or unable to sit in silence, pause for a moment. Ask yourself what is scarce, not what you are feeling. What is scarce? Because the feeling is a response. The scarcity is the cause. And once you can see the cause, you can start to do something about it. Not by changing who you are, but by finding one small way to give yourself a little more room.